right, so I am going to begin recording now. Welcome to this module 5A, the meaning of governance, where did it come from, and how can it be made good? So this is a kind of overview session that talks about, as the next slide shows, the rise of governance language. So where did this discussion about governance, the use of this terminology, even come from? The application of governance in different contexts. So we use this in political contexts, economic ones, corporate, and also for your purposes in the nonprofit sector as well. And we'll also critically assess notions of good governance. So what exactly makes governance good? So start with what is governance? And these are just some definitions. Governance represents the range of both informal and formal values, norms, practices, and institutions that provide better order than if we relied purely upon formal regulations and institutions. That's a definition by Weiss. So what he's saying here is that governance is beyond things that have been formalized. So norms and values, practices that have also developed over time can be considered elements of governance. So formal and informal. The next definition says the various ways through which social life is coordinated. Governance is therefore a process or a complex of processes. So it's a process, it's not just some kind of static thing. And this one is the last one is my definition. And it says, in its most basic form, one might consider that governance is about how governments function, and outside of government, how other entities structure or organize their activities. Simplified then, one might think of governance as government taken as a verb. That is the act of governing. So how do you organize your activities? And this can be linked back to these other two. What kinds of processes do you use to organize your activities? And these can include values and norms as well, institutions, practices. So governance is something that's not just for governments then. We can have governance anywhere. And some people like to equate governance with management. I mean, in some ways there is a connection between the two of these terms, but management tends to focus, in my estimation, a lot on the technical elements of how you organize processes and institutions, whilst governance can go beyond the technical. But some approaches to governance are very much within a management kind of paradigm that focuses on like technicalities and procedures and so on. Yeah. So when we come to, hello?
Hi, it's Melissa. Good morning. Good afternoon, everyone.
Hi, Melissa. We just started.
Okay, good.
So we had a little bit of problems with the link, so I apologize for that. And I was just going through a definition of governance.
Okay,
so
all right.
Here on the screen, you will see some definitions of governance. And I was saying that governance is not only management, but management can be viewed as included within governance, and that governance is not restricted to governments alone. So we can see processes considered governance within a wide array of sectors and institutions beyond the government. But good governance, and this term governance, really emerged in some ways within the political context and has then been applied to other areas, economic, non-governmental, and so on. So what we're going to look at next, I'll show you the slide before, which says what we will cover. The rise of governance language. We just started with that definition, and now we're going to go to the next part, which addresses the rise of governance language and really connects this to good governance as well, which is on this first slide where we see critically assessing notions of good governance. So I've kind of combined these in the presentation of the slides. So good governance. Where did this terminology come from? Now, at the end of the Cold War, y'all know about the Cold War, right?
Yes.
Yeah. So when the Soviet Union fell, the Iron Curtain was lifted, and we were in a supposedly new era in which, I suppose, liberalism has triumphed along with democratic forms of government. There began to be the emergence of this term good governance, which is connected or was connected to democratization movements that were attributed to some of the activities that helped to undermine some authoritarian regimes. So there was this connection made between civil society organizations and activities within civil society and democratization, and by extension, good governance. So in this context of the end of the Cold War, there was more space opened to have these discussions about how states govern themselves, rather than focusing on the ideological conflict between East and West, so between so-called communist states and democratic ones. Instead of focusing on ideology, now this space opened for discussions about how countries actually govern, organize themselves, what systems and practices do they use. And good governance has generally been connected to democratic governance. So governance that is democratic, accountable, and transparent. These are the types of terms we hear often when talking about good governance. And therefore, we had the encouragement of liberal democratic practices. So we're talking about regular elections, avoiding corruption and misuse of resources, reforming electoral systems to ensure that they are, in fact, more democratic, accountable, and open, having clear rules for public office holders so that there's this transparency, and public office holders are not laws unto themselves then. And connected to this again, public sector reform. So reforming the public sector or the civil service so that there is this accountability and transparency, and there are systems in place to help avoid corruption, capture of resources, and the like. Okay. We also have this focus of government within new public management, which is an area that focuses on the public sector in particular. And here, there is an emphasis on new public governance thereafter. So a movement from this kind of management paradigm, as I mentioned, towards a governance paradigm within discussions about the public sector. And again, here we see several discussions about efficiency and reform within the public sector. So how do we get public sectors to work better so that they deliver their services to those who the public sector is supposed to serve in a timely manner, and that they deliver high quality services? And this also has included collaborative approaches across the public sector and with society. So this means that ministries and governments then should not act in silos without having discussions with each other. And they also should not act in ways that are disconnected from discussions with the societies that they're supposed to serve. So this idea of governance, in addition to talking about accountability and transparency, speaks about democracy in ways that go beyond elections then. Democracy in terms of collaboration with wider society. Okay, can I continue to the next one? Yeah?
Yes.
Right. So good governance is supposed to allow for certain things. It should facilitate development initiatives and allow for the gains from development programs, funding to be experienced by the population. This is because if resources are not being captured or inefficiently allocated, people should be able to better feel the benefits of some development initiative or funding that is provided, or even taxpayer money that is being used by the government. Populations also should be able to register discontent if they do not experience these gains. So good governance should allow for populations to voice their discontent, and not just to voice it like shouting into the wind, but to voice their discontent and to have their concerns acknowledged and addressed. And this takes us to the next point of involvement by citizens in processes of decision making. And when we say in processes of decision making, this is really critical because what tends to happen, in particular in the Caribbean, is that citizens are involved towards the end of processes when decisions have already been made, either in full or have mostly been, locked in. Then you have this inclusion of citizens, town hall meetings, or perhaps sometimes it's selective inclusion early on in processes. So in some of my work, which has addressed trade policy, one of the observations is that when there are trade decisions to be made, decisions relating to trade policy, there tends to be some inclusion of particular civil society organizations like chambers of commerce or groups that are viewed as commercial entities, while other groups are not included early on in the process. They tend to be informed or included towards the end of some kind of decision-making process. And this term good governance really says to us, is supposed to say to us, that decision-making should be collaborative and that people should have an input. This doesn't mean that every group or every individual that has an input will get their way, but it means that their perspectives should be heard and considered. And intergovernmental agencies and donors, so these are organizations that may be giving money to developing countries in particular, they have placed emphasis on good governance, especially following the Cold War. So they have provided funding, resources, training, literature that focuses on developing good governance in the public sector, in electoral processes, and even in the nonprofit sector, so across civil society organizations. There are efforts to encourage good governance. So this means for civil society organizations then that there should be a level of accountability and transparency also. This time now to the groups that you maybe represent or that you are working on behalf of. One of the emphases also is on getting institutions to function well. And often this means to function in ways that are efficient. So to deliver services in a way that makes sense, that's timely, people can get high quality services. And these things have sometimes been emphasized by intergovernmental agencies and donors as requirements for receiving donor assistance or funding. Either that countries illustrate that they are well governed or make an effort to show that they're working on their governance processes. And as I said, these kinds of emphases on good governance and what it entails have also been applied to other entities such as civil society organizations. And this takes us to the next point. We see that good governance is a concept that is applied in settings beyond the government. So in corporate governance and NGO governance. So you all already had the session with Erica, right? Did y'all attend or were you able to listen in on the video on it?
I was there last night.
Yeah. So what did you all discuss relating to NGO governance or the governance of civil society organizations? Briefly.
Basically the separation of governance and management in regards to how usually management comes under staff and stuff, while governance is more the board of directors.
Mm-hmm.
But how sometimes it crosses over, so you'll have persons on the board sometimes, in staff positions, especially in smaller organizations.
Right. And so that's what this point here kind of captures. When we talk about good governance in other settings, corporate governance, NGO governance, there's still this emphasis on transparency, accountability or responsibility, fairness, and independence. And So we can focus on stakeholders. When we're talking about corporate settings, the stakeholders may tend to be shareholders if this is a public company. So there's a level of accountability to shareholders. Management should be accountable to the board. There should be accountability to customers if we're talking about a corporate environment. And similarly, within NGOs or civil society organizations, there should be a level of accountability, as I'm sure you all discussed yesterday, to the board, by staff, or if there's another layer of management, and to those who the organization is supposed to serve, whether it is a cause or a community or some group of people. So people should be able to ask questions and get responses. And this also may tend to require a lot of documentation as well, to show that you're not just making things up, so that you keep records and that these records are easily available to those who have a stake or an interest in what it is the organization is doing. And this can include funders. Funders often require that governance practices are so-called good, that they're transparent, that they're accountable, so that they can feel confident that the funds that they are considering giving to a particular organization will not be mismanaged or stolen or anything of the sort, anything untoward. But there's a little bit of an issue with this concept of good governance, because it presents this kind of binary that's not always helpful. So the opposite of good, we know, is usually bad, right? And sometimes there are organizations, institutions, governments that may not be able to meet up or match up, rather, to all the criteria of good governance. But does this mean that they are bad? Maybe there are reasons that they're not able to do all of the things expected under this umbrella of good governance. And this tends to lead to developing countries and their institutions in particular often being portrayed as having poor or bad governance. And sometimes this may be true, but sometimes it's not fully accurate, and it also reinforces these negative ideas about developing countries, about people in developing countries, and institutions in developing countries. And we could even racialize this some way, and in some ways, and say the non-white world. So groups that tend to be othered. That's me using my kind of academic speak there. But there are some capacity issues that organizations may face in living up to the requirements of good governance. And I will take that up. Do we have any questions so far?
No questions for me. It's pretty straightforward so far.
Okay.
No questions for me either.
All right. So I'll continue. So, good governance is an ideal then. This is what I want to portray to you. It's an ideal that most organizations should aspire towards, we can assert, but are often unable to live up to. And this may have to do with capacity constraints. But whether we're talking about governments or we're talking about companies or non-governmental organizations, it's often a process of being better and better governed, I would say, rather than focusing on good governance, on trying to do things better and better over time. So that even the most developed, advanced democracies of the world have governance issues. If we are following the international politics, we can see that there are some issues in Britain with the Prime Minister addressing Brexit and proroguing Parliament, and then being told that his prorogation of Parliament is unconstitutional. These are some governance issues. And we can see these around the world in political settings and also in other settings. We can see it in corporate settings, even of some of the wealthiest and largest companies in the world. They may have some governance challenges that need to be addressed over time. So as this final bullet point I have here says, there's another concept that has been developed by people such as Grindle and Evans. who talk about good enough governance. So this is an emphasis not on trying to be mediocre, not on just saying, okay, we can be good enough, but instead of thinking that institutions or entities that do not meet governance requirements are not good, therefore bad, maybe we could concentrate on whether they're doing things that are good enough. Are they making an effort? Have they been making progress towards better and better governance practices? And when we think about this, we can think about, going back up to this first bullet point on the slide, we can think about capacity constraints that may hinder entities in their pursuit of good governance. So if we're talking about governments, for instance, sometimes their capacity limitations mean that they're unable to collect taxes effectively. This may have to do with staffing issues in the public sector. It may have to do with maybe not having the technical expertise to set up appropriate tax structures, may have a lot to do with tax avoidance and evasion inside of the country and facing difficulties addressing this. This may not always be a lack of will, political will as we call it, on the part of government, but it may be a capacity issue that perhaps they may need to address or find ways to address in order to be better governed, and therefore to deliver things to the society and communities they serve better. There may be capacity constraints, and I'm sure this may resonate with you all within civil society organizations, to put in place and manage legal and regulatory frameworks. And so I would say from the perspective of civil society organizations, perhaps even working within legal and regulatory frameworks poses some serious capacity constraints, such as even understanding these frameworks and living up to them. So in parts of the region, for instance, that may require civil society organizations to be audited, or let's say if donors want civil society organizations to be audited to show that there are no financial improprieties, sometimes this can be very difficult because to have an audit may be a costly exercise, and if organizations don't have adequate staffing and they're mostly voluntary, they may not even have the appropriate paper trail to allow for an audit to occur. So it's not that the organizations are attempting to be badly governed, but this is the result of a capacity constraint. Yes, Kendron?
Hi, okay, so I just wanted to say one quick thing
Yes.
before I go, because I have to leave in 10 minutes. I have work.
I'll be finished by then.
Okay, so I actually represented my youth arm at the Conservative Party conference in Manchester in the United Kingdom.
Yes.
And quite a few things interesting happened with respect to good governance. My personal view, probably as a conservatist, is that the UK is doing a phenomenal job with their economy and their policies. However, because they have a very active opposition with Jeremy Corbyn, they called a referendum in 2016 where 17.4 million persons voted to leave the European Union. And to date, the United Kingdom aren't still allowed because of other issues, including their constitution. No, I'm just thinking, if I were to be one of that 17.4 million, I would have seen the Conservatives as not so good governance, because in their eyes, in their opinion, they voted to leave the EU and majority wanted to leave, but the government still aren't able to leave. But if you don't fully understand other aspects of their laws and policies, then you would term it as probably bad government or bad governance.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think that tends to be the case, right? So when we talk about accountability, institutions and organizations are supposed to be accountable,
Right.
but sometimes things that constrain them in being accountable to their members, if it's a membership-based organization, maybe to constituents, if we're talking about a government, or the people on whose behalf, or the cause on whose behalf you're supposed to be working, may have to do with some things that are technical, maybe to some extent out of the hands of the individuals inside of the organization. And that is, one of the difficulties with the good governance kind of narrative. It doesn't always take into consideration at face value some of these constraints to delivering on what even well-meaning organizations intend to do. So even the next point I have here about utilizing funding. Suppose you access funding from an institution. It might be a grant, and you need to use this grant to do certain things within a 6-month time period. If you don't have the adequate staffing to run this program that you're supposed to run or project, and also to report on it, you may not even be able to adequately or appropriately use the funds or resources that you were able to win. And this may reflect that you are not very well governed. That is partially true, but what's also a constraint that needs to be taken into consideration is that you may have people who are working on a voluntary business who are burnt out, they're tired. They have to work, they have other things to do, and even though they have all intentions of doing certain things, they can't deliver on that appropriately. And this takes us to the next point about documentation and reporting as well. Because one of the ways that institutions can show transparency and can be accountable is by documenting their work, their finances, how they use funds, all of these kinds of things. And when institutions are constrained, sometimes the reporting is not as good as it should be. Sometimes it's even absent. And many civil society organizations in the region don't even have a lot of historical documentation about their organization, some of the longer standing ones. So we can ask questions as to whether this means that they were poorly governed, or is it that they were constrained in their capacity to do some of these things, even though they have been working in a very fruitful way.
Okay, thank you for that, Christina.
Sure. I'm going to take us to the next slide, which is the last one, because I promised to try and keep this to half an hour today, because I understand that these sessions may be long and people have other things to do. And this is the worksheet activity for this session. So I hope that I did not go too quickly and that nothing here was too complex, but the worksheet activity asks you to give an assessment of what factors contribute to governance being good. And that's what I have up here on this slide. So what I would like you all to do coming out of this session and the one that you had previously with Erica is to think about the things that you are going to put into these boxes. You don't have to fill out all of them, okay? If you don't think there are as many as this, that's fine. If you think there are more things, feel free to add more arrows and boxes at will. But I just want you to go back and reflect on what factors contribute to governance being good. Is it intention? Is intention enough? Or do we have to see evidence that governance is good, that procedures were followed and everything is in order, right? And that's basically it. I'm open to your questions and comments, and I can go back through anything that you all want me to review at this point, because I recognize the session was a bit fast, but I intended to make it that way because I know they have been long. So the floor is open. Y'all can ask whatever questions or comments you wish.
If I may, it's really clear to me, Christina. So hopefully in the classroom, in Google Classroom, if this is posted, I can just get it done and send it. Will it be posted there?
Well, this is already in, there's a package in the Google Classroom that has the course outline.
Right.
This is in there. So there's that
Okay.
in the classwork that has CSO training program course outline. This worksheet is in there, and the other worksheets I believe should also be in that document. But if you need me to send it as a standalone in the classroom, I could also do that.
Okay, that would be great. So maybe I could just print it and upload it.
Okay, no problem.
All right, but I have to go now. I have work.
No problem. I'm finished, so it's just questions at this point. Thank you so much for your participation.
You're welcome, Christina, and thank you for hosting it.
Sure.
All right, bye, everyone.
Bye.
Bye. Christina, I'm also gonna run because I've got some stuff to do, but thank you very much.
Okay. Well, if you have any questions along the way, feel free to just put them in the classroom, or y'all can send me an email.
Okay, will do. Thanks again.
Sure, no problem.
Bye.
Bye. Melissa, do you have a question or comment?
No, not at this time. I think the information was very clear.
Okay. Wasn't too fast?
Okay. No.
Okay.
Great. So if I do have any questions, I'll send that via email.
Okay. Perfect.
All right. Great.
Okay. So should I end the session?
I think so. Kanisha, do you have any questions?
She's muted.
Oh, okay.
I'm trying to unmute her.
Oh.
It's not working. So.
I suppose you might not have, but if we do, we're gonna email you.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. Well, thank you for your participation, and my apologies again for the link not working initially.
Okay, no problem.
I'm glad you showed up. All right. So have a great weekend.
You too. Bye-bye.
All right. Bye.